For the first 6 or 7 seasons in the hybrid era, there was only one engine to have in Formula 1, and that was the Mercedes engine. Whatever they were cooking up at Ilmore, Brixworth, AMG Performance Powertrains, or whatever the hell it's called, they probably should have been awarded several Michelin stars. In doing so, Mercedes scored 71 of the 79 poles available between the start of 2014 and the beginning of 2018, which is a formidable stat, it has to be said. But at the start of the 2017 season, with the new regulations that brought back the wide boy types of cars that looked more aggressive, had more aero on tap, and big massive tyres that harked back to the late 80s and early 90s, Ferrari was back and looking to put a dent in Mercedes' stranglehold on the top spots in Formula 1. Especially now that there was only one Mercedes driver to fight and not two, because Rosberg had retired and Bottas was now in the other car. By the time the 2018 season rolled around, the teams were limited to 3 engines over the course of the season to try and reduce the cost because, well, those engines are pretty expensive. And the 2026 regulations aim to not only reduce the costs, but at the same time make the cars smaller and lighter to try and bring back some of the magic of the series. In doing so, it means that effectively, teams need to ration their equipment, because use too many components, and you start taking grid penalties. McLaren and Honda, I'm looking squarely in your direction, as well as Renault, because they were also having a few problems. And the running of these components in the race is quite complicated. If you've ever used any of the hybrid cars in Assetto Corsa, iRacing or Le Mans Ultimate, you'll have had to juggle the power output to suit over the course of the race, or the session that you're running. Now, iRacing's system is a little clunky, given that it's not exactly a great representation of how the hybrid systems in some cars actually work, and that you're limited to just 4 changes of profile per lap, probably to stop people exploiting the system. But in Assetto Corsa you do have a little bit more freedom, so I'm going to use Assetto Corsa to try and sort of sum up how it all works. So here's a shot from the cockpit of the Formula Hybrid 2020 car by RSS, and a link to their shop will be in the description for you. Now, before people go, why not the VRC one, it's better, or why not the Ferrari SF70H? The reason is, this is a simpler display to explain what is what. On the left, you have ERS, that's the total overall amount of battery power available to you. So as long as there is hybrid go juice in the battery, you can use it. So long as the lap bar has some left, that is. The bar on the right is your allocation for the whole lap. If you run out of that, the bar on the left will not go down. If the ERS bar is empty, the lap bar won't go down. They're kind of dependent on each other. So while driving around, you'll use the controls on your steering wheel or on your keyboard to sort of try and manage everything, whether that's the amount of regeneration under braking, the amount of engine braking, the amount of deploy, whether you're using the manual boost, and so on and so forth. So this brings us back to the race weekends. With the cars needing to save the engine components for the races, since the points are given out on Sunday and not on Friday, doing 1-lap glory runs to measure your chap against the rest of the field is just going to knacker the engine in the long run. And as the engine gets older and more worn, it's going to lose power. Typically, in this time period, the teams would use a brand new engine for the first round of the season, use a new one for the Canadian Grand Prix, which is where they would usually bring an upgrade, and then maybe another one around Spa or Monza, depending on how their season has gone. And they might have another couple of upgrades to bring over the course of the season as well. So over the course of the race weekend, the engines will be turned down for practice, turned right up for qualifying, and then sort of have a middle ground for the actual Grand Prix. And at the 2018 Australian Grand Prix, Mercedes started the year where they left off, with Hamilton sticking his car on pole for that particular Grand Prix, a time that was nearly 7/10 clear of Raikkonen in second, with Vettel and Verstappen close in behind, with a small gap back to Ricciardo. What's also interesting to note is that 7 years later, only 2 of the top 7 on the grid for this race are still in Formula 1, and they have 11 titles between them. Madness. But it's in the press conference after qualifying where people started licking their lips over potential controversy. In testing, references had been made to something that Hamilton had called party mode, which had some people on social media and the actual media thinking that Mercedes had unlocked some sort of super secret extra setting on their engines that gave them way more horsepower than anybody else, and in some cases unlocked something in the engine mappings that was against some sort of rule that the FIA had put in place. Like, was Mercedes bypassing the max hybrid deploy rules or the fuel flow rules? While Lewis had mentioned this party mode in testing, it wasn't until Australia that it became evident that Mercedes might have something cooking. In the second qualifying session at the Albert Park circuit in Melbourne, Vettel had been fastest in that particular session, with Hamilton and Bottas close in behind, with Verstappen half a second off the pace. But it's only the second qualifying session, or Q2 as it gets referred to, because abbreviating everything is cool. For reference, I've tracked the start of all of that to be around 2008 or so before Sky Sports began their monopolising of pretty much all sport. They'll be taking the Six Nations next. But anyway, it was close, and when the first runs were done in the third qualifying session, just .061 separated the top three, which at the time was Hamilton with a 122.051, Vettel 0.034 behind, and Verstappen 0.061 behind. With 5 minutes on the clock, there was time for data to be quickly analysed, drivers to psych themselves up, and engines to be cranked. Or, if you're Mercedes, deploy this so-called party mode. Hamilton started his final lap and went .441 faster through Sector 1 without even trying. Raikkonen crossed through the Sector 1 timing beam to go a tenth faster than his previous best, but Hamilton was going faster still, taking 6/10 out of his provisional pole lap in Sector 2, without using all the track at the fast left-right chicane over the back end of the circuit. Raikkonen, by comparison, was 2/10 up on his previous over the same section of track. Verstappen, the same. As Hamilton crossed the line, he'd gone .887 faster than his previous lap. Raikkonen was listed as being .664 off the pace. Vettel in third was .674 and Verstappen .715. Yes, I'm reusing a graphic here, but I'm showing you a reminder of how things played out. It's not quite Villeneuve demolishing Frentzen by over a second in 1997, but it was still a lap that made people go, oh, it's going to be one of those seasons, isn't it? And look at how different the pole time was to Gasly's time right at the back, nearly 4 seconds. Shows how much they lay it all out in that final session. In the press conference afterwards, a mention was made about this so-called party mode, and Lewis categorically denied that they had such a thing. Vettel asked, "So what were you doing then?" To which Lewis replied, "I was waiting to get a good lap in, to wipe the smile off your face," and then admitted that Vettel would probably make him eat those words after the Grand Prix, which he did, but Lewis knew that he was setting himself up for that. But the thing is, party mode doesn't have that much of an advantage at Melbourne, with Vettel saying that Lewis had made the difference more than this setting had. But we all know it was the car that did it. It's the same press conference where Kimi was on screensaver after Lewis said that Kimi parties all the time. But while we're on the subject, that press conference is a little bit weird, because usually you're looking at the three drivers, you got pole or first place in the middle, then usually second place is to the left of the first place driver if we're looking at the three drivers, and then third is on the far right. They were swapped over for this. Just something I noticed. But Lewis was right. There was no magical hidden setting. Party mode is just a nickname given to cranking the engine up to what Mercedes has predetermined to be the maximum optimal power for what they want to do with it. It's no different to saying turning it up to 11, a phrase that is well rooted in our vernacular for referencing someone or something going all out. And if you don't know where that phrase comes from, it's from a film called This Is Spinal Tap, a mock documentary about a band called Spinal Tap. In it is a scene where we're being shown the band's equipment, and we are shown that the Marshall amplifier heads all go to 11 rather than 10 because, and I quote, "it's one louder." And that's where we get the term. The volume slider on the BBC's iPlayer goes up to 11 as a bit of a nod to Spinal Tap, and there's also some Fender amplifiers from the 50s and 60s that go to 12. But I digress. Because of how the engines need to be saved, party mode, turning it up to 11 or whatever you want to call it, is only used sparingly. 1 lap per weekend, if that. Probably depended on how much of an advantage Mercedes had on rivals at a particular circuit. Daniel Ricciardo said that Lewis's lap was like getting a pie in the face, and Mercedes themselves were surprised at how big the gap was because Melbourne isn't even a power track. Later on, Mercedes admitted that they have 3 distinct modes on their steering wheels. They have one for most of free practice, one for most of qualifying, and one for most of the race. Within those 3 modes, there can be some fine-tuning if they need to do it. There are various sub-settings when it comes to the amount of engine power on tap, and also various settings when it comes to the deployment and regeneration of the hybrid power, and this can be changed on a lap-by-lap basis or a corner-by-corner basis if they really want to do it. Heading back to the Assetto Corsa explainer, the hybrid power settings available are no deploy, which is just the ICE and turbocharger working together, charging, which has a somewhat limited amount of deployment, but you're going to be charging the battery faster than you're spending the charge that you've saved up. You've then got balanced low, which is a balanced setting that has the batteries kick in at higher speeds, and then you've got balanced high, which is the same as low but deploys the hybrid at lower speeds for more corner exit power delivery. Then you've got overtake, which keeps the deploy cranked at higher speeds to allow you to blow by another car, and then you've got hot lap, which is a very aggressive deployment setting that is usually reserved for, well, hot lapping. And with this graphic I made for a video on the hybrid stuff I did years ago, it kind of shows you how they work in theory. This is just an illustration and not meant to be exactly what Mercedes or Ferrari or Renault or Honda were running. What Mercedes was actually running is going to be shrouded in mystery for a very, very long time. It's not something that they're going to give out willingly. And the same goes for the engine mapping as well. Because of the lack of refueling in the modern era, drivers are going to need to save a bit before they can push a bit. Cars might run in a high engine mode for the first 2 laps or so of the Grand Prix and then wind it back a bit once things have settled down. They can then crank it for the in-lap and out-lap and turn it right down for a safety car period to save that little bit extra. Then, if need be, they can turn it back up in the final phase of the race if they can see that the car ahead or the cars ahead are falling off. Maybe Hamilton did that at Abu Dhabi last year. Who knows? And engine modes and fuel saving and things like that aren't exactly a new thing because of the hybrid era. This stuff has been happening since the 80s and the turbo years. And this is usually the time that Christian Horner, as he often did in this time period, would go to the media and say that it should be banned. But the thing is, Renault, Ferrari and Honda all had party modes of some description, and seeing them banned might put the others at a disadvantage. Especially Honda, and Red Bull was looking to get anything it could from its weaker engine compared to the Mercedes and Ferrari offerings, because the Renault was, well, it was crap at that point. Still is, isn't it? But in 2020, the ban did come. It was all done by the FIA to try and reduce some of the deficit that Ferrari, Honda and Renault had to Mercedes, because it was clear that despite all 4 manufacturers having a party mode, number 11, warp mode, whatever you want to call it, the Mercedes had a vastly superior party mode. And with engine development at the time being quite the subject because of tokens, freezes and so on, it would mean that Mercedes would have an advantage locked in for some time if something wasn't done. So the FIA decided that from around September 2020 onwards, you had to use the modes that you use in the race in qualifying. No more cranking the engine to maximum, which did suck a little bit. Not because Mercedes was getting nerfed, but the third qualifying session is really the only time these days you get to see cars on the absolute ragged edge. But it had a lot of people saying that it wouldn't do much, because if Mercedes already had a powerful engine, then it would still be powerful on race day. But not exactly. Let's just say that for the sake of argument, Mercedes party mode gave them 1050 horsepower. Ferraris gave them 1035, Renault's 1020 and Honda's 1000. Mercedes, in qualifying with party mode, has 15 horsepower on Ferrari, 30 on Renault and 50 on Honda, which is a lot. I know this isn't the actual figures from the time, this is just for illustration purposes only. My maths is terrible, I need to simplify it for myself rather than you. Now put the cars into race mode and the Mercedes engine has 1020, Ferrari 1015, Renault 1010 and Honda 995. The power grouping is now much closer between Mercedes, Ferrari and Renault, which, in theory, should make qualifying more competitive at places like Baku, Monza, Spa and places like that. Because they were no longer allowed to use party mode, they weren't stressing the engines in the third qualifying session anymore, so they were able to eke out the engine life a little bit more. And because the other teams weren't having to crank and Mercedes weren't having to crank, Mercedes might be able to stretch their engine life out to an extra race, so that come the end of the season, they might have an engine that's got, 100, 200 fewer miles on it, and that could prove to be quite the advantage. But it is what it is. At the same time, it's amazing how things will be picked up and run with just because of a throwaway comment made by one driver. A simple nickname that led to articles left, right and centre and discussion online about how Mercedes had this secret thing that was going to cause them to dominate the season. But Mercedes didn't dominate the season. Mercedes didn't properly get going until the German Grand Prix of that year, and didn't win a race until round 4 of the season, which was at Baku. Funnily enough, that was the first round of the season where party mode would show how much of an advantage it could give to Mercedes. But at the same time, Ferrari was cooking something on their engines, which ended up being quite controversial. So then, a look at something that was on a particular car but didn't exist in the way a lot of people thought it did, or still do even today, if that makes any sense. If this video about Mercedes party mode was interesting for you and you think I did a good job with it, then do like the video so I know I did a good job. And for more stuff like this from the channel, get subscribed and also get that bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help keep things running around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships for Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan Millward, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.